The eviction notice had been taped to her door at 6 in the morning, while the children were still asleep, while the coffee maker gurgled its last drops from grounds she'd already used twice. Margaret Holloway stood in the hallway of the Briarwood apartment complex in her bare feet, her nightgown thin against the November cold, seeping through the walls, and she read the words 3 times before they became real. 14 days. She had 14 days to vacate the premises with her 2 children, her secondhand furniture, her 3 boxes of photographs, and whatever remained of her dignity after 4 years of struggling to keep them all alive. She didn't cry. She had stopped crying 18 months ago, when her husband David had driven away in his company car with a suitcase and a woman named Renee, and had never looked back. Not even when their daughter Emma asked why Daddy didn't want to see her paintings anymore. Margaret had learned that tears were a luxury, like fresh vegetables and new shoes, and heating bills paid on time. She simply folded the notice into a small square, tucked it into the pocket of her nightgown, and went back inside to start the oatmeal for breakfast. The apartment was cold. The thermostat was set to 58 degrees because anything higher would push the electric bill past what she could afford. And even at 58, she was already 2 months behind. The children slept under 3 blankets each, and Margaret had given them her winter coat to use as an extra layer on the coldest nights, which meant she walked to her cleaning jobs in a cardigan and a scarf wrapped twice around her neck, her hands red and cracked from the chemicals and the wind. Emma was 7. She had Margaret's dark hair and her father's grey eyes, and she drew constantly, obsessively, filling notebook after notebook with pictures of houses with gardens and families eating dinner together and dogs that they couldn't afford to own. Her drawings were getting darker lately. The houses had fewer windows. The families stood farther apart. Oliver was 4. He had just started asking why they couldn't buy the cereal with the cartoon tiger on the box, why they couldn't go to the zoo like the other kids at his preschool, why their apartment was so cold when Tommy's house was warm. Margaret had no answers for him. She had only oatmeal and tap water and a smile that she forced onto her face every morning, like armour. She stirred the oats and watched them bubble and thought about where they would go in 14 days. Her parents were dead. Her sister lived in Arizona with a husband who had made it clear that Margaret was not welcome in their home, that her failure was contagious, that divorce was a disease of character. David's family had closed ranks around him the moment he left, their lawyers sending letters that made it clear child support would be minimal and contact would be even less. She had no friends left. Poverty had a way of winnowing friendships down to nothing, because eventually you stopped accepting invitations you couldn't reciprocate, stopped answering calls when you had no good news to share, stopped existing in the world of normal people who had enough. The shelter on 5th Street had a 6-week waiting list. The church on Maple Avenue offered meals but not beds. The Women's Centre had given her pamphlets and sympathy, and nothing else. In 14 days, Margaret Holloway and her 2 children would have nowhere to go, and the oatmeal was burning because she had stopped stirring, and the smoke alarm began to shriek. And that was when Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, her eyes wide with fear, her stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest. "Mummy, what's happening?" Margaret turned off the stove, fanned the smoke away with a dish towel, and knelt down to meet her daughter's eyes. "Nothing, sweetheart. Everything's fine. Just a little accident." But Emma was 7, and 7 was old enough to know when adults were lying. She looked at her mother's face, at the lines that had deepened over the past year, at the forced steadiness of her smile, and she said very quietly, "Are we going to be okay?" Margaret pulled her daughter into her arms and held her tight, breathing in the smell of children's shampoo and sleep and innocence, and she whispered, "Yes, I promise, we're going to be okay." She had no idea how, but mothers made promises they didn't know how to keep, and then they found ways to keep them anyway. That was the job. That was the only job that mattered. The first cleaning shift of the day was at the Prescott Building downtown, a gleaming tower of glass and steel, where investment bankers and corporate lawyers made more in an hour than Margaret made in a month. She took the service elevator to the 40th floor, invisible in her grey uniform, and she scrubbed toilets and vacuumed carpets and emptied trash cans while Men in expensive suits talked on their phones about market projections and merger opportunities. She overheard their conversations. She understood more than they thought she did. Margaret had 2 years of college before she dropped out to marry David, and she still remembered enough economics to know that these men were discussing sums of money that could change her life forever, that could buy her children safety and stability and hope. But the money flowed through this building like water through a pipe, never stopping, never touching her, and she was just the woman on her knees, scrubbing the grout between the tiles in the executive bathroom. At noon, she took her 15-minute break in the supply closet, eating a sandwich she'd made from the last of the bread and the peanut butter that was almost empty. Her phone buzzed with a text from the daycare where Oliver spent his mornings, a reminder that her account was 60 days past due and that payment would need to be made by Friday, or other arrangements would be necessary. Other arrangements, such a clean, professional way to say that her 4-year-old would be turned away at the door, that she would have no one to watch him while she worked, that the fragile architecture of her survival would collapse entirely. She closed her eyes and leaned against the shelving unit full of industrial cleaning products, and she allowed herself 30 seconds of despair, 30 seconds to feel the weight of it all, the impossibility of it, the crushing momentum of poverty that pushed her down and down and down, no matter how hard she fought. Then she opened her eyes, finished her sandwich, and went back to work. The second shift was at a dental office in the medical district. The third was at a private residence on the wealthy side of town, a house so large that she couldn't imagine how anyone filled all those rooms with living, a house with fresh flowers in crystal vases and a refrigerator full of food that no one seemed to eat. The woman who owned it never spoke to Margaret directly, only communicated through handwritten notes left on the kitchen counter. Clean the grout in the master bath. Dust the chandeliers. Polish the silver. Margaret polished the silver. She polished it until her arms ached, until her reflection stared back at her from the surface of the serving tray, and she barely recognized the woman she saw. When had she become so thin? When had her eyes become so hollow? When had the girl who had once believed in love and family and a future become this grey creature, scrubbing someone else's silver in someone else's house, while her children waited in a cold apartment for her to come home? It was 8:30 by the time she picked up Emma from aftercare and Oliver from the evening programme at the community centre. They were tired and hungry, and Oliver had been crying because another child had pushed him, and no one had noticed, and Emma was quiet in the way that worried Margaret most, the silence of a child carrying burdens too heavy for her small shoulders. They walked home because the car had died 2 months ago, and she couldn't afford to fix it. The November wind cut through Margaret's cardigan and made her teeth chatter, but she gave Emma her scarf and carried Oliver most of the way, his warm weight against her hip, his small hands clutching her collar. "Mommy," Emma said, "why do we have to walk everywhere?" "Because walking is good for us," Margaret said. "It makes us strong." Tommy's mum drives a van, a big one with seats in the back and a TV. "Different families do things differently, sweetheart." "But why do we have to be different?" Margaret had no answer for that. She just kept walking, one foot in front of the other, her daughter's question hanging in the cold air like breath made visible. The letter was waiting for her when they got home, slipped under the door, an envelope of heavy cream-coloured paper with her name written in formal calligraphy. Margaret assumed it was another bill, another demand for money she didn't have, but when she opened it, she found something she didn't understand. The letterhead read, "Whitmore and Associates, Attorneys at Law." The text below was dense with legal language, but certain phrases jumped out at her. Estate of Eleanora Whitmore, deceased. Sole beneficiary. Lighthouse property located at Herons Point, Maine. Transfer of ownership for the sum of $1. She read it 3 times. Then she read it a 4th time, standing in her cold kitchen, while Emma heated up leftover soup on the stove, and Oliver watched cartoons on the ancient television with the cracked screen. Eleanora Whitmore. The name meant nothing to her. Margaret had no relatives in Maine, no connections to any lighthouses, no reason to be named in anyone's estate. It had to be a mistake, or a scam, some elaborate fraud designed to extract money from desperate people who would believe anything that sounded like hope. But the letter included a phone number, and Margaret called it, expecting a disconnected line or a recorded message asking for her credit card information. Instead, a woman answered on the third ring, her voice professional and warm. "Whitmore and Associates, this is Patricia speaking. My name is Margaret Holloway. I received a letter about an inheritance, but I think there's been some kind of mistake. One moment, please." The sound of typing. "Ah, yes, Mrs. Holloway. Actually, Ms. Holloway now, I see. No, there's no mistake. You've been named as the sole beneficiary in the estate of Eleanor Whitmore. The property is a lighthouse at Heron's Point, transferred to you for the symbolic sum of $1 upon execution of the necessary paperwork. But I don't know anyone named Eleanor Whitmore. I've never even been to Maine." The late Mrs. Whitmore was a private woman. She left very specific instructions in her will, and your name was clearly designated. I understand this must be surprising, but I can assure you that everything is entirely legitimate. The property is yours if you choose to accept it. Margaret leaned against the kitchen counter, her heart beating in a strange, unsteady rhythm. What kind of property? What condition is it in? A pause. "I should be honest with you, Miss Holloway. The lighthouse has been unoccupied for several years. It requires significant work. The structure is sound, but the interiors are in need of renovation. There's no current heating system, and the electrical needs updating. However, the land itself is valuable. Waterfront property in that area has appreciated considerably. If you chose to sell, you could likely find a buyer willing to take on the renovation themselves. How much would it sell for? In its current condition, perhaps $60,000 to $70,000. Renovated considerably more, $60,000. The number swam in Margaret's mind like something impossible, like a fairy tale number, like a number that belonged to other people in other lives. $60,000 could pay off her debts, could secure an apartment, could buy a car that worked, could give her children a chance. "I need to think about this," she said. "Of course, but Ms. Holloway, there is a deadline. The property must be claimed in person within 30 days of Mrs. Whitmore's death, or it reverts to the state. You would need to travel to Heron's Point, sign the paperwork, and take possession of the deed. The 30 days expire on December 15th. 14 days from now, the same day she was supposed to be out of her apartment, as if the universe were offering her an escape hatch and a trap at the same time. "Thank you," Margaret said. "I'll be in touch." She hung up the phone and looked at her children. Emma was spooning soup into bowls, careful and precise, a child who had learned too young how not to waste anything. Oliver was laughing at something on the television, a sound so rare and precious that Margaret felt it like a physical sensation in her chest. Maine, a lighthouse, a mysterious inheritance from a woman she'd never met. It was impossible. It was absurd. But then again, so was everything about her life now. The eviction notice, the empty refrigerator, the children sleeping under coats because she couldn't afford heat. Perhaps impossibility was just the shape the world took when you had nothing left to lose. They left 3 days later, everything they owned packed into a rented van that Margaret paid for with the last of her credit card limit. The apartment was empty behind them, the keys left with the building manager, the eviction rendered irrelevant by departure. There was nothing to go back to now, only forward, toward a lighthouse she'd never seen, owned by a woman she'd never known, in a town she couldn't find on a map without Google. The drive took 11 hours. Emma read books in the back seat while Oliver slept against his car seat straps, and Margaret drove through the grey November landscape, through Connecticut and Massachusetts, and into Maine, watching the trees turn skeletal and the towns grow smaller and farther apart. She stopped once for gas and once for a bathroom break, buying the children a bag of chips from a vending machine because it was cheaper than real food, and she tried not to think about what would happen if the lighthouse was uninhabitable, if the inheritance was a cruel joke, if she had driven her children into the wilderness for nothing. Heron's Point was not a town so much as an idea of a town. A general store, a post office, a handful of houses scattered along a rocky coastline, and a single road that wound up toward the bluffs, where the lighthouse stood. Margaret found it just before sunset, the building silhouetted against an orange and purple sky, and she pulled the van to a stop and simply stared. It was beautiful, even in its ruin, even with its paint peeling and its windows dark and its garden overgrown with salt-stunted weeds. It was beautiful. The lighthouse tower rose white against the darkening sky, the keeper's cottage attached at its base, and beyond it all, the Atlantic Ocean stretched to the horizon, vast and grey and ancient. Margaret had never seen the ocean before. She hadn't realised it would look like this, like the edge of the world, like the place where everything ended and began. "Is this ours?" Emma asked from the back seat, her voice small with wonder. "It might be," Margaret said. "Let's go see." The cottage was cold and dusty and full of shadows. Margaret found the electrical panel and discovered that the power had been turned off, so she used the flashlight on her phone to guide the children inside, their footsteps echoing on the wooden floors. The furniture was covered with white sheets like ghosts, and the air smelled of salt and mildew and years of neglect, but the roof didn't leak, and the walls were solid, and the windows, though dirty, were intact. "It's spooky," Oliver said, pressing close to Margaret's leg. "It's an adventure," Margaret told him, "like a story. We're explorers discovering a new land." She found candles in the kitchen, old ones that had melted and re-solidified in the cold, and she lit them with matches from a tin on the mantel. The flickering light transformed the cottage into something almost magical, shadows dancing on the walls, the dust motes swirling like tiny stars. Emma walked from room to room with wide eyes, touching things carefully, reverently, as if she couldn't quite believe they were real. "There's a fireplace," she announced, "and a staircase, and a door that goes up into the tower. We'll explore tomorrow," Margaret said. "Tonight we make camp." She dragged the mattress from the bedroom into the main room, near the fireplace, and she managed to coax a fire into life, with old newspapers and wood that had been stacked on the porch. The heat was meagre but real, spreading slowly through the room, and the children ate granola bars and drank water from the bottles Margaret had packed, and eventually they fell asleep on the mattress, under every blanket they'd brought, curled together like puppies. Margaret sat by the fire and watched them breathe, her children, her everything. She had brought them here on faith, on hope, on the desperate belief that somehow this strange inheritance would save them. And now she was sitting in a cold lighthouse, in the dark, wondering if she had made the worst decision of her life. She stayed awake until the fire burned down to embers, and then she lay down beside her children and closed her eyes, and she didn't dream at all. Morning came grey and cold, the ocean visible through the salt-stained windows, waves rolling endlessly toward the shore. Margaret made breakfast from the last of the granola bars and some instant coffee she'd packed, and then she called the number on the letter again and arranged to meet with the attorney in town. Patricia Whitmore, no relation to the deceased, she explained, was a small woman with steel-grey hair and kind eyes, behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her office was the back room of the general store, a desk and 2 filing cabinets, and a law degree from the University of Maine hanging on the wall. She shook Margaret's hand and offered her tea, and looked at Emma and Oliver with the particular softness that some women reserve for children in difficult circumstances. "So," Patricia said, settling into her chair, "you've seen the lighthouse. We slept there last night. Adventurous. I'm not sure I'd recommend that until the heating is sorted, but I admire the spirit." She opened a folder on her desk and spread out several documents. "I have the paperwork here. Deed transfer, property records, the will itself. Everything is straightforward. You sign, you pay the symbolic $1, the lighthouse is yours." "I still don't understand why," Margaret said. "Eleanora Whitmore. I've never heard that name in my life. Why would she leave anything to me?" Patricia removed her glasses and cleaned them with a cloth, a gesture that seemed designed to give her time to choose her words. "Eleanora was a complicated woman. She lived in that lighthouse for 43 years, alone for the last 20. She had no children of her own, no living relatives that we could identify. She was secretive, private, the kind of person who kept her history close to her chest. But she knew me somehow, knew my name." "Apparently so." Patricia replaced her glasses. "I can only tell you what's in the documents she left. Your name, your address, a note indicating that you were to be the sole beneficiary, that the lighthouse was to go to you and no one else. She didn't explain her reasoning, and I didn't ask. It wasn't my place. Margaret looked at the documents, the legal language swimming before her eyes. Something was wrong here. Something didn't add up. But her children were in the next room looking at picture books from the general store's small shelf, and she had nowhere else to go. And $60,000 was a sum that could change everything. She signed the papers. She paid the dollar. The lighthouse was hers. The first week was survival. Margaret got the electricity turned on, discovered that the heating system was not just inadequate, but non-existent. The cottage had been heated by wood stoves that had been removed years ago, and bought a space heater from the general store that she ran constantly in the main room. She enrolled Emma in the local elementary school, a building so small that all the grades shared a single playground, and found a neighbour willing to watch Oliver for a few hours each day, while she worked on making the cottage livable. The work was endless. Years of neglect had left their mark on every surface. Water stains on the ceilings, mould in the bathroom, windows that didn't seal properly against the wind. Margaret cleaned and scrubbed and patched, her hands raw and aching, her body exhausted by the end of each day. But the children adapted. Emma made friends at her new school, came home with stories about a girl named Lily, who had a boat, and a boy named Marcus, who could name all the constellations. Oliver discovered the beach, the tide pools, the crabs that scuttled sideways across the rocks. They were still poor, still struggling, but there was space here, an air, and the endless rhythm of the waves, and for the first time in years, Margaret saw her children run simply for the joy of running. She tried not to think about the mystery. Eleanor Whitmore, the woman who had lived alone in this lighthouse for decades, who had left her entire estate to a stranger. Margaret found traces of her everywhere, books on the shelves with her name written inside the covers, photographs on the walls of a younger woman standing at the top of the tower, clothes in the closets that smelled of lavender and age. But there were gaps too. Personal letters had been burned in the fireplace, the ashes still visible in the grate. Drawers were empty where they shouldn't have been. Someone had systematically removed all evidence of Eleanor's connections to the outside world. It was Oliver who found the door to the basement. He was playing in the kitchen, crawling under the table the way 4-year-olds do, and he discovered a seam in the floor that Margaret had assumed was decorative. But when he pulled at it, a section of the wooden planks lifted up on hinges, revealing a steep staircase leading down into darkness. "Mommy, a secret passage." Margaret's first instinct was to close it, nail it shut, forget it existed. Basements in old buildings were dangerous places. Mould, structural damage, things that could hurt small children. But something made her pause, something about the care with which the door had been concealed, the deliberate carpentry that made it invisible, unless you knew where to look. This wasn't a simple cellar. This was something Eleanor Whitmore had wanted to keep hidden. She got her flashlight and told the children to stay upstairs. Then she descended. The basement was small and dry, cut directly into the rock beneath the cottage. Stone walls, a stone floor, a single room, maybe 15 feet square. And in the centre of that room, illuminated by Margaret's flashlight, was a collection of objects that made no sense at all. Filing cabinets, 4 of them tall and metal, the kind used in offices. A wooden trunk, old and battered, with brass fittings. A desk small and utilitarian, with a typewriter that looked like it belonged in a museum. And on the walls, photographs, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, pinned directly to the stone. Margaret approached the photographs first. Black and white images, faded with age, showing people she didn't recognize. A family, it seemed, a man and a woman and 3 children, posed formally in what looked like a parlour from another era. The same family at a beach, the children grown older, a young woman in a graduation gown, a wedding portrait, the bride unsmiling, the groom's face. Turned slightly away from the camera, she looked closer at the bride, something about the shape of her face, the set of her jaw, the darkness of her eyes. Something familiar. She opened the filing cabinets. Papers. Thousands of pages of papers organised with meticulous care into folders labelled with dates and names. Birth certificates, death certificates, marriage licenses, financial records going back decades. And letters. So many letters, handwritten on aging paper, the ink faded but still legible. Margaret pulled out a folder at random and began to read. The story emerged slowly, over hours and then days, as Margaret pieced together the contents of Eleanor Whitmore's secret archive. It was a story of wealth and betrayal, of family and silence, of a wrong that had been hidden for generations and was now, finally, coming to light. Eleanor Whitmore had been born Eleanor Crane, the youngest daughter of one of Maine's wealthiest families. The Cranes had made their fortune in shipping, in timber, in the industries that had built New England, and by the early 20th century they owned half the coastline and most of the politicians who governed it. Eleanor had grown up in luxury, educated at the finest schools, destined for a marriage that would consolidate the family's power. But Eleanor had fallen in love with the wrong man. His name was Thomas Holloway. He was the lighthouse keeper's son, poor and uneducated and completely unsuitable by the standards of the Crane family. When Eleanor became pregnant, her father gave her a choice: give up the child and marry the man he had selected for her, or be cut off entirely, disinherited, erased from the family as if she had never existed. Eleanor chose love. She married Thomas in secret, gave birth to a son in the lighthouse where they lived, and spent the first years of her marriage in poverty but in joy. Her family, true to their word, pretended she had died. Her name was removed from the family records. Her inheritance, which should have been substantial, was redistributed among her siblings. Then Thomas died. A storm, a fall from the lighthouse tower, an accident that the coroner ruled suspicious but couldn't prove was anything more. Eleanor was 26 years old, a widow with a young son, and she had nothing except the lighthouse and her suspicions. The documents in the basement told the rest of the story. Eleanor had spent 40 years gathering evidence, bank records showing payments made to the coroner who had ruled on Thomas's death, letters between her brothers discussing the problem of her marriage and the solution that had been implemented, photographs of men who had been seen near the lighthouse in the days before Thomas died, men who worked for the Crane family, men who had later been rewarded with promotions and property. The Cranes had murdered Thomas Holloway. They had killed him because he had dared to marry above his station, because Eleanor had chosen him over, then because the family name was more important than a human life. But there was more. The son, Eleanor, and Thomas's child had grown up in the lighthouse, had married, had children of his own. The family line had continued, documented in Eleanor's careful records, births and marriages and deaths, a family tree branching forward through time, away from the Cranes who had tried to erase them. Margaret sat on the cold stone floor of the basement, surrounded by decades of secrets, and she understood. The family tree ended with her name, Margaret Holloway, great-granddaughter of Eleanor and Thomas, heir to a legacy of love and murder and hidden truth. She was a Crane. She had always been a Crane, and the family that had killed her great-grandfather, that had stolen her birthright, that had tried to pretend her entire bloodline didn't exist, they were still out there, still wealthy, still powerful, still lying. The Crane family, Margaret learned, was no longer the empire it had once been. The shipping business had collapsed decades ago. The timber operations sold off. The political connections faded with time, but they were far from poor. Harrison Crane III, the current patriarch, had diversified into real estate and finance, building a new fortune on the foundations of the old. He lived in Portland now, in a house that was featured in architectural magazines, and he sat on the boards of hospitals and museums and charitable foundations. He was respected. He was admired. He was the kind of man whose name opened doors and whose money smoothed over any inconvenient questions. Margaret found his photograph online. He was 73 years old, silver-haired and distinguished, with the kind of face that radiated confidence and authority. He had 3 children, all of them successful, all of them married to the right people, all of them living lives that Margaret couldn't imagine. The Crane family website showed photos of charity galas and ribbon-cutting ceremonies, Harrison shaking hands with governors and senators, his family arranged around him like props in a display of power. This was the man whose grandfather had ordered the murder of Thomas Holloway. This was the family that had erased Eleanora from their history. This was the legacy that Margaret had inherited without knowing it, not the lighthouse, but the truth. She called Patricia Whitmore and asked if they could meet again. "I found something," Margaret said, when they were seated in the back room of the general store. "In the basement, documents, evidence about the Crane family." Patricia's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "I wondered when you'd find those." "You knew." "I knew Eleanora had secrets. I didn't know what they were. She made me promise not to touch anything in that basement, not to tell anyone it existed, not until you'd had a chance to see it for yourself." Patricia folded her hands on the desk. She spent her whole life gathering that evidence. She wanted the truth to come out, but she was afraid of what the Cranes would do if they knew. She waited too long, got too old, got sick. By the end, she couldn't do anything except make sure the evidence survived her. "Why me? Why not go public herself?" "Because you're family. Because the story means something different when it's told by an heir than when it's told by an old woman with a grudge. And because," Patricia hesitated, "because she wanted you to have a choice. The Cranes don't know you exist. They don't know the documents exist. You could take this public and destroy them, or you could walk away and live your life in peace. She wanted that decision to be yours." Margaret thought about her children, sleeping in the lighthouse, trusting her to keep them safe. She thought about the eviction notice that had started all of this, the months of hunger and cold and despair. She thought about Thomas Holloway, 23 years old, thrown from a lighthouse tower because he had dared to love above his station. "I want to meet them," she said. "The Cranes. I want to look them in the eye and tell them what I know." Patricia was quiet for a long moment. "That's dangerous." "I know. They have lawyers, resources, connections. If you threaten them, they'll fight back." "I know. They might try to discredit you, call you a fraud, a liar, a gold digger. They might try to take the lighthouse, challenge the will, tie you up in court for years." "I know," Margaret met Patricia's eyes, "but I can't walk away. I can't pretend I don't know what they did. My children deserve to know where they come from. Thomas Holloway deserves justice, even if it's 100 years too late." Patricia nodded slowly. "Then let me make some calls. I know a journalist in Portland who's been looking for a story like this. I know a lawyer who specializes in estate disputes. If you're going to do this, you're going to need help." "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet." Patricia's expression was serious. "The Cranes have buried secrets for generations. They won't let you dig them up without a fight." The weeks that followed were a strange mixture of ordinary life and extraordinary preparation. Margaret cleaned the lighthouse, enrolled the children in activities at the community centre, learned the names of their neighbours and the rhythms of the small coastal town. She made dinners from whatever she could afford, helped Emma with her homework, read Oliver stories before bed. She was still poor, still struggling, still counting every penny, but there was a roof over their heads now, a roof that belonged to them and that made everything else bearable. At night, after the children were asleep, she went down to the basement and continued Eleanora's work. She organised the documents, created a timeline of events, cross-referenced names and dates until the story was clear enough to tell. The journalist Patricia had mentioned came to visit, a woman named Sarah Chen, middle-aged and sharp-eyed, who worked for a newspaper in Portland and had a reputation for investigating the powerful. She spent 2 days in the basement, reading, photographing, asking questions. When she emerged, her face was pale. "This is real," Sarah said. "This is all real." "I know. If I publish this, it will destroy them. Harrison Crane, his whole family, everything they've built is sitting on a foundation of murder and theft. Once people know, they'll lose everything." "Good." Sarah looked at her carefully. "You don't want money? You don't want a settlement, a quiet payout to make this go away?" "I want the truth. I want everyone to know what they did, what they covered up, what they stole. Money won't bring Thomas Holloway back, but the truth might give his memory some peace." Sarah nodded. "All right. Give me a month to verify everything, to get legal to sign off, to make sure we're bulletproof. Then we publish." But the Cranes found out first. Margaret never learned how. Perhaps someone at the newspaper talked. Perhaps Patricia's phone calls had been monitored. Perhaps the family had maintained surveillance on the lighthouse all these years, waiting for exactly this kind of threat. However it happened, the result was the same. a black car pulling up to the lighthouse on a December morning, 3 weeks before Sarah Chen's story was scheduled to run. Margaret was outside with the children, watching them play on the rocky beach when the car arrived. 2 men got out first, large, silent, wearing dark suits that didn't fit the coastal landscape. Then a third figure emerged from the back seat, an older woman, elegant and composed, wrapped in a cashmere coat that probably cost more than everything Margaret owned. "Margaret Holloway?" The woman's voice was cool and measured. "My name is Victoria Crane. I believe we have matters to discuss." Margaret sent the children inside with instructions to stay in their room and not come out. Then she faced Victoria Crane on the wind-swept porch of the lighthouse, 2 women from opposite ends of a century-old wrong. "I know who you are," Margaret said, "and I know why you're here." Victoria smiled, but her eyes remained cold. "Then you know that this situation needs to be resolved. Quietly, privately, without any unpleasantness. The murder of my great-grandfather was unpleasant. The theft of my family's inheritance was unpleasant. The decades of lies and cover-ups, those were unpleasant. I think a little more unpleasantness is exactly what your family deserves. You have no proof of murder. You have old documents, old letters, the ravings of a bitter old woman who spent her life nursing a grudge. None of it would hold up in court." "I'm not going to court. I'm going to the press." Victoria's composure flickered just for a moment. "That would be inadvisable. My father is not a man who takes kindly to threats. He has resources you can't imagine, connections that reach into every corner of this state. If you attack our family publicly, we will defend ourselves. And I promise you, Ms. Holloway, you will not enjoy the experience." "Is that a threat?" "It's a statement of fact." Victoria stepped closer, her voice dropping. "You're a single mother with 2 children and no money. You live in a crumbling lighthouse that will cost more to repair than it's worth. You have no job, no prospects, no future except whatever scraps you can claw together from the wreckage of your life. I'm offering you an alternative. Walk away. Forget what you found in that basement. Sign a non-disclosure agreement, and in exchange, you'll receive, let's say, $200,000. Enough to start over somewhere warm, enough to give your children a real future." Margaret thought about the offer. $200,000. More money than she had ever imagined having. Enough to buy a house, a car, stability, safety. Enough to make all her problems disappear. But then she thought about Eleonora, alone in this lighthouse, for 40 years, gathering evidence, waiting for justice. She thought about Thomas, falling from the tower, murdered for the crime of being poor. She thought about Emma and Oliver, her children, who would grow up knowing that their mother had been offered money to hide the truth and had accepted it. "No," Victoria's eyes narrowed. "No? My family has been silenced for 100 years. You've stolen everything from us. Our name, our history, our inheritance. I won't let you steal our truth too. Then you've made your choice." Victoria turned toward the car, then paused. "I want you to understand something, Ms. Holloway. My father is 83 years old. He built our family back from nothing after my grandfather's mismanagement nearly destroyed us. He has spent his entire life protecting the Crane name, and he will not allow some nobody to tear it down. Whatever happens next, remember, you chose this." She got into the car, the doors closed, the black vehicle pulled away, leaving Margaret alone on the porch with the sound of the waves and the weight of what she had just done. The next weeks were a siege. The Cranes moved with the efficiency of people who had been handling inconvenient truths for generations. First came the lawyers, cease and desist letters, threats of defamation lawsuits, challenges to Eleonora's will claiming that the documents were forged, that the inheritance was invalid, that Margaret had no right to the lighthouse or anything in it. Then came the investigators. Private detectives dug into Margaret's past, looking for anything that could discredit her. They interviewed her former landlord, her ex-husband, her old colleagues from the cleaning company. They found her parking tickets, her credit card debt, her failed marriage. They painted a picture of a desperate woman who would do anything for money, who had invented a connection to the Crane family to extort them. Then came the media. Stories began appearing online, carefully planted pieces that questioned Margaret's motives, her sanity, her reliability. Anonymous sources described her as unstable, as a con artist, as a woman who had abandoned her job and dragged her children across the country chasing a fantasy. Through it all, Margaret held firm. She answered every legal challenge with Patricia's help. She refused every interview request from hostile outlets. She documented every act of harassment, every threatening letter, every suspicious car that lingered too long outside the lighthouse, and she waited for Sarah Chen's story to run. It was Emma who almost broke her. The other children at school had started talking. They had heard things from their parents, seen things online, absorbed the narrative that the Cranes were pushing. Emma came home one day in tears, her face red and streaked with snot, and she threw herself into Margaret's arms and sobbed. "They say you're a liar. They say we don't belong here. They say we're going to get thrown out and have to live on the street. Is it true? Mommy, is it true?" Margaret held her daughter and felt something crack inside her chest. This was the cost, not the legal bills or the sleepless nights or the fear, but this. Her children, caught in a war they didn't understand, paying the price for a truth that wasn't their burden to bear. "Listen to me," she said, kneeling so she could look Emma in the eyes. "I am not a liar. Everything I've told you is true. We belong here. This lighthouse is ours and no one is going to take it away from us. There are some people who don't want other people to know the truth, and they're trying to scare us into being quiet. But I won't be quiet, and I won't lie, and I won't let anyone hurt you. Do you understand?" Emma nodded, still crying. "But why do they hate us?" "They don't hate you, sweetheart. They're afraid. Afraid of what happens when secrets come out. Afraid of being caught. Afraid of having to face what they've done." Margaret wiped her daughter's tears with her thumb. "Sometimes, when people do bad things, they get angry at the people who catch them. It's not fair, and it's not right, but it's how they are. We just have to be stronger than their fear." Are we strong enough? Margaret thought about that question. She thought about the cold apartment in New Jersey, the eviction notice, the walk through the November wind with Oliver in her arms. She thought about the drive to Maine, the first night in the lighthouse, the discovery of the basement. She thought about standing on the porch facing Victoria Crane, refusing $200,000 because some things were worth more than money. "Yes," she said, "we are." The story broke on a Sunday morning in mid-January. Sarah Chen's article was comprehensive, meticulously sourced, devastating. It traced the Crane family's history from the murder of Thomas Holloway through decades of cover-ups and financial manipulation, documenting every step of the conspiracy with evidence from Eleanora's archive. Photographs of the original documents accompanied the text. Interviews with historians and legal experts confirmed that the evidence was credible. A forensic accountant had analysed the financial records and concluded that millions of dollars had been improperly diverted from Eleanora's inheritance to her siblings and their descendants. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Other newspapers picked up the story. Television news programs ran segments about the Crane family scandal. Social media erupted with outrage, with curiosity, with the particular fascination that Americans reserve for the downfall of the wealthy and powerful. And then 3 days after the story broke, Harrison Crane III scheduled a press conference. Margaret watched it on the small television, in the lighthouse, the children at school, the house quiet except for the sound of the waves outside. Harrison looked older than his photographs, diminished somehow, his silver hair less impressive under the harsh lights of the hotel ballroom where the conference was being held. Victoria stood behind him, her face a mask of controlled fury. Other family members were scattered throughout the room, lawyers and publicists hovering nearby like worried satellites. "I want to address the recent allegations against my family," Harrison began, his voice steady but somehow hollow. "These claims are based on documents that are over a century old, gathered by a woman who had a personal grudge against my grandfather's generation. They do not reflect the values or the actions of the Crane family today," he went on. He expressed regret for any historical wrongdoing that might have occurred. He announced a charitable donation to a foundation supporting victims of domestic violence, as if money could paper over murder. He emphasized the Crane family's contributions to the community, the jobs they had created, the institutions they had supported. He did not apologize. He did not admit guilt. He did not acknowledge that Margaret Holloway existed at all. When the questions started, Margaret turned off the television. She already knew how this would go. The Cranes would deny, deflect, delay. They would use their money and their connections to muddy the waters, to make the story too complicated for ordinary people to follow, to wait for the news cycle to move on to the next scandal. But something had changed. The truth was out now, documented and public, preserved in newspaper archives and internet databases where it could never be erased again. The Crane family name would carry this stain forever. Every future generation, every business deal, every charitable board appointment would be shadowed by the knowledge of what they had done. It wasn't justice, not really. Thomas Holloway was still dead. Eleanora had still spent her life alone and afraid. Margaret's children had still suffered. Were still suffering, would carry the scars of this year, forever. But it was something. A wound that had been hidden for a century was finally exposed to the light. And light, Margaret had learned, was the only thing that could start the healing. The settlement offer came a month later. Not from Victoria this time, but from a law firm that specialised in quiet resolutions to noisy problems. The terms were straightforward. In exchange for Margaret's agreement to cease all public discussion of the Crane family history, the family would pay her the full value of Eleanor's original inheritance, adjusted for inflation and interest. The sum was substantial, enough to renovate the lighthouse 10 times over, enough to secure her children's futures, enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life. Margaret met with Patricia and Sarah to discuss the offer. They sat in the lighthouse's main room, now warm with a new heating system that Margaret had installed with a small business loan, and they passed the settlement documents around the table. "It's a lot of money," Sarah said, "and the story is already out there. Taking this doesn't erase what we published. But it ends the fight," Patricia added. "No more lawsuits, no more harassment, no more stress. You'd have security, real security, for the first time in years." Margaret looked at the documents. The numbers swam before her eyes, zeros multiplying into impossible sums. Money that could buy safety, comfort, peace. Money that could give Emma art lessons and Oliver a college fund. Money that could replace the years of poverty with something that looked like a normal life. "What about the truth?" she asked. "The truth is public record now," Sarah said. "Nothing can change that. The question is whether you want to keep fighting or whether you want to start living." Margaret thought about Eleanora again, about the decades spent in this lighthouse, alone, gathering evidence, waiting for justice that never came. She thought about what it had cost her, not just her inheritance, but her life, her chances at happiness, her ability to be anything other than a guardian of secrets. "I don't want to be a prisoner of the past," Margaret said slowly. "Eleanora spent her whole life fighting, and in the end, she died alone. I don't want that for my children. I don't want that for myself." "So you'll take the settlement?" Margaret picked up a pen. She looked at the documents, at the legal language that would end the war between her family and the Cranes, and then she put the pen down again. "I'll take the money," she said, "but I have conditions." The final confrontation happened in a conference room in Portland, a glass-walled space on the top floor of a building that overlooked the harbour. Margaret sat on one side of the table, Patricia beside her. On the other side sat Harrison Crane III, Victoria, and a phalanx of lawyers whose hourly rates probably exceeded Margaret's former annual salary. Harrison looked tired. The scandal had aged him, stripped away the veneer of confidence that had defined his public image. He sat with his hands folded on the table, watching Margaret with eyes that held something she hadn't expected to see. Curiosity. "Miss Holloway," he said, his voice quiet, "I've read your conditions. I confess I don't understand them." "What's to understand? I want an apology. A public acknowledgement that the Crane family wronged Eleanora and Thomas. A statement that the evidence in her archive is authentic and that the historical record has been corrected." "You want us to admit to murder?" "I want you to admit to the truth." Silence. Victoria's jaw tightened, but Harrison raised a hand to stop whatever she was about to say. "You could have asked for more money," he said. "You could have demanded control of family businesses, seats on our boards, any number of things that would have given you power over us. Instead, you want words, an apology. Why?" Margaret met his eyes. "Because my great-grandmother spent 40 years alone in that lighthouse. gathering evidence, hoping that someday someone would listen. She never got to hear you say you were sorry. She never got to see the world acknowledge that her husband was murdered and her family was destroyed. She died waiting for justice that never came. Margaret leaned forward. I can't bring her back. I can't undo what was done, but I can make sure that her truth is spoken out loud by the people who owe it to her. That's worth more to me than any amount of money. Harrison was quiet for a long moment. The lawyers shifted uncomfortably. Victoria stared at Margaret with unconcealed hostility, her fingers tapping an impatient rhythm on the table. My grandfather was a hard man, Harrison said finally. He did things that none of us would condone today. He believed that family honor was worth any price, even the price of human lives. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I've spent my life trying to build something better than what he left me. I've tried to use the Crane name for good, to support the community, to create opportunities, but I can't pretend that the foundation wasn't rotten. I can't pretend that my family didn't build its success on suffering. He looked at Margaret, and for the first time, she saw something like shame in his expression. I'm sorry on behalf of my family for what was done to Thomas Holloway and to Eleanora, for the cover-up, for the lies, for the decades of denial. I'm sorry. The room was silent. Victoria looked like she had swallowed something bitter. The lawyers sat frozen, uncertain how to respond to an admission that they had surely advised against. Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. Not forgiveness. That would come later, if it came at all. But something like release. The weight she had been carrying, the burden of Eleanora's secrets, lifted just slightly. The truth had been spoken. After 100 years, finally, it had been spoken. Thank you, she said. The lighthouse stood white, against a summer sky, fresh paint gleaming in the afternoon sun. The garden that had been overgrown with weeds now bloomed with wildflowers and coastal grasses. The windows sparkled, clean and whole. The keeper's cottage had been renovated with care. Modern amenities blended seamlessly with the historic architecture, and inside the walls were covered with photographs, not just Eleanora's now, but new ones as well. Emma's school pictures, Oliver blowing out birthday candles, Margaret standing at the top of the lighthouse tower, looking out at the ocean she had learned to love. It had been 18 months since the settlement. Margaret had used the money wisely. The renovations, a college fund for each child, investments that would grow over time. She'd started a small business offering lighthouse tours to tourists who came to Heron's Point in the summer, telling the story of Eleanora and Thomas to visitors who listened with wide eyes and asked questions that proved the truth still mattered. Emma was 9 now, still drawing constantly, but her pictures had changed. The houses had windows again. The family stood close together. There was a lighthouse in almost every image, rising tall against skies that were always blue. Oliver was 6, starting first grade in the fall, already reading chapter books and asking questions about everything. He had befriended every fisherman in the harbour, knew the names of all the boats, dreamed of owning his own someday. The boy who had once asked why their apartment was cold now ran barefoot on the beach, brown from the sun, laughing at the gulls that wheeled overhead. Margaret stood at the window of the lighthouse kitchen, watching her children play in the garden, and she thought about the journey that had brought them here. The eviction notice, the mysterious letter, the drive through the November darkness, the basement full of secrets, the confrontation with Victoria, the press conference, the settlement, the apology. She thought about Eleanora, the great-grandmother she had never met, who had loved a man enough to give up everything, and had spent her life making sure that sacrifice wasn't forgotten. She thought about Thomas, dead at 23, murdered for wanting something the world told him he couldn't have. She thought about herself, Margaret Holloway, cleaning woman, divorced mother, impoverished and desperate and alone, and the woman she had become, someone who owned a lighthouse, someone who had faced down one of the wealthiest families in Maine, and someone who had taught her children that the truth was worth fighting for, even when fighting seemed impossible. The ocean glittered in the sunlight, endless and eternal, waves rolling toward the shore, the way they had for millennia, the way they would roll long after Margaret and her children and even the lighthouse itself had crumbled back into the rock. She watched the water and felt for the first time in years something like peace. There was a knock at the door, Oliver's voice, excited and breathless. "Mum, Mum, come look! A whale, there's a whale!" Margaret smiled and went to see. The lighthouse keeper's cottage at Heron's Point became something of a landmark in the years that followed. Tourists came in increasing numbers, drawn by the story that had made national news, by the architectural beauty of the restored buildings, by the breathtaking views of the Atlantic coastline. Margaret hired local teenagers to help with the tours during busy summers, taught them the history of the lighthouse and the family that had loved it, watched them develop the same pride in the place that she felt herself. The Crane family faded from public view. Harrison died quietly 2 years after the settlement, his obituaries mentioning the scandal only briefly, as a footnote to a life that had been larger and longer than that single shameful chapter. Victoria took over the family's remaining businesses, ran them competently and without fanfare, never spoke to Margaret again. The younger generation scattered, some keeping the family name, others changing it, all of them carrying the weight of the history that had finally been exposed. Sarah Chen won a journalism award for her coverage of the story. Patricia Whitmore retired and bought a cottage down the coast from the lighthouse, close enough to visit, but far enough to have her own peace. The town of Heron's Point, once barely more than a name on a map, grew slowly, with new residents drawn by the same things that had surprised Margaret when she first arrived. The beauty, the quiet, the sense that here, at the edge of the world, life could be lived at a different pace. Emma grew up and went to art school in Boston, supported by the trust fund Margaret had established with the settlement money. She painted lighthouses, of course. They appeared in her work constantly, rising white and steadfast against storms and sunsets and starry skies. But she painted other things too, mothers holding children, families gathered around tables, moments of ordinary grace that she had learned to see as precious because she'd once known what it meant to live without them. Oliver became a marine biologist, drawn to the ocean that had surrounded his childhood, the tidal pools where he had first discovered the complexity of life. He studied climate change and its effects on coastal ecosystems, published papers that his mother didn't entirely understand, but displayed proudly in the lighthouse gift shop. He brought his own children to Heron's Point every summer, taught them to swim in the same coves where he had learned, showed them the room in the basement where their great-great-great-grandmother's secrets had waited for a century to be found. And Margaret became old, as everyone does who is lucky enough to live long. Her hair turned grey, then white. Her hands, once raw and cracked from cleaning chemicals, softened and spotted with age. She moved more, slowly, thought more deeply, spent long afternoons in the garden or on the porch watching the ocean change colours as the sun crossed the sky. She was 81 years old when the lighthouse was designated a National Historic Landmark. The ceremony brought dignitaries from Augusta and Washington, historians and journalists, and members of the community who had watched the lighthouse's transformation over decades. Margaret sat in a chair at the front of the crowd, a blanket over her legs despite the warmth of the June day, and she listened as speakers talked about preservation and heritage and the importance of remembering. When it was her turn to speak, she stood slowly, refusing the help that was offered, and she looked out at the faces gathered before her, strangers and friends, her children and grandchildren, people whose lives had been touched by a story that began with a poor lighthouse keeper falling in love with a rich man's daughter more than 100 years ago. This lighthouse, she said, her voice thin but clear, stood here for a long time before I found it. It guided ships through storms. It kept watch over this coast when there was no one else to keep watch. And for many years, it held a secret, a truth that powerful people wanted to stay buried. She paused, looking up at the tower that rose white against the summer sky. I didn't come here looking for truth. I came here looking for shelter. I was a mother with 2 children and nowhere to go, and this lighthouse was offered to me like a life raft. I didn't know then that accepting it would change everything, that it would lead me to a family history I never knew existed, that it would put me in the path of people who wanted that history to stay hidden, that it would teach me what I was capable of when I had something worth fighting for. Her eyes found Emma and Oliver in the crowd, grown now, their own children squirming in their laps. But here's what I've learned in all the years since. Truth matters. It matters more than money, more than power, more than safety. Because the people who try to bury the truth, they're doing it because they know that truth has power too. The power to change things. The power to hold people accountable. The power to say, this happened, this was real, this cannot be forgotten. She smiled, and in that smile was everything she had survived. The cold apartment, the endless work, the drive through the darkness, the confrontation with Victoria Crane, the years of building something from the wreckage of what had been destroyed. Eleanora Whitmore, my great-grandmother, spent 40 years alone in this lighthouse, gathering the evidence that would eventually expose the people who wronged her. She never got to see justice done. She never got to stand here in the sunlight, surrounded by family, knowing that her work mattered. But I believe she knows now. I believe, wherever she is, she can see this. All of you here, honouring her story, making sure it won't be forgotten. Margaret looked at the lighthouse one more time. The light at the top, restored and functional, still flashed its pattern every night. A rhythm that sailors had followed for generations. A beacon guiding the lost towards safety. This lighthouse isn't just a building, she said. It's a reminder that even in the darkest times, there is light. That even when powerful forces try to hide the truth, truth finds a way to shine through. That mothers, all the mothers who sacrifice and struggle and refuse to give up, they are the keepers of that light. They are the ones who tend it, who protect it, who pass it on to their children. She sat down, the applause washing over her like the sound of waves on the shore. Emma was crying. Oliver was holding his daughter, pointing at the lighthouse, whispering something that made her laugh. And Margaret closed her eyes and felt the sun on her face, and knew that she had done what she was born to do. She had found the truth. She had told it. She had raised her children in its light. What more could any mother ask for? The lighthouse still stands at Heron's Point, white and weathered and eternal against the changing sky. Tourists still visit in the summers, still hear the story of Eleanora and Thomas, still climb the spiral staircase to look out at the ocean that stretches to the edge of the world. The gift shop sells postcards and magnets, and a book that Emma illustrated, telling her family's history in pictures that have been called masterpieces of narrative art. In the basement, the filing cabinets still stand, though their contents are now preserved in archives and museums, scanned and digitized and available to anyone who wants to know the truth. The photographs that Eleanora pinned to the stone walls have been carefully framed and hung in the Lighthouse Museum, where visitors can see the faces of the people who lived and loved and suffered and survived. And in the garden near the cliff's edge, where the wildflowers bloom thickest, there is a small stone marker. It was placed there by Margaret in her final year, when she knew her time was short, and it bears a simple inscription. For Eleanora and Thomas, whose love outlasted everything. For Emma and Oliver, who are the reason for everything. For all the mothers who fight, who endure, who survive. The light keeps shining. The wind blows off the ocean, carrying the smell of salt and the sound of distant waves. The lighthouse stands. The light keeps shining. And somewhere, in the hearts of all who know this story, the truth, that bright and stubborn flame, burns on.